The grain of old mahogany wood doesn't keep secrets. It simply waits for someone with the right tools to uncover them. When you spend your entire life restoring 18th century European furniture, you learn that every mark, every hidden seam, and every false drawer tracking tells a specific story about human greed. I remember the exact weight of the dust on my fingers when my chisel hit a structural anomaly beneath the base of an antique French commode. It wasn't an encrypted phone. There was no blue light, no digital server, and no network ping. It was just a small, heavy piece of hand-forged iron, a master key to a private bank vault downtown. And when I turned that key in the dark, the assets waiting inside didn't just prove my fiancé was an adulterer, they proved he was systematically robbing me of the legacy my father left in my hands. Let me tell you about the quietest execution Wall Street has ever seen. My name is Sienna. I am 24 years old. If you saw me working in my private studio in the historic Shipyard District of Boston, wearing a stained canvas apron and using a traditional steel plane to smooth a block of raw walnut wood, you would think I was a woman who existed entirely outside the modern cycle of corporate greed. I have long, heavy, platinum blonde hair that I usually tie back loosely to keep away from the machinery, clear, deep blue eyes that can identify a structural flaw in a piece of timber from 10 feet away, and a life that I spent 4 years building on a foundation of absolute stability. I work as a high-end furniture restorer, specializing in the conservation of historical heirlooms for the city's oldest families. My profession requires a profound level of patience. You cannot rush the curing of old varnish. You cannot force wood fibers to realign after a century of neglect. I believed I had integrated that exact precision into our relationship with Julian. We lived in an expansive, custom-designed loft overlooking the harbor, a space filled with the scent of beeswax, aged oak, and the quiet music of old records. Julian was 32. He was the managing director and chief auctioneer of the Sterling Exchange, Boston's most elite historical artifact and antique auction house. Julian was a master of value estimation. He was tall, with defined features, dark hair clipped short at the sides, and a quiet, aristocratic eloquence that allowed him to make an assembly of billionaires compete furiously for a broken piece of Renaissance porcelain. He knew how to construct desire. He knew how to frame an object's history so beautifully that people forgot its material flaws. We had been together for 4 long, seamless years. Our relationship felt like a perfect architectural drawing. I was the silent craftsman, validating the authenticity of the assets behind the scenes. He was the public force, displaying them under the gallery lights. We were scheduled to be married in December at a historic estate in Rhode Island. The invitations had been delivered, the contracts with the estate managers had been cleared, and the entire high society of New England was waiting for our union. Because Julian's auction house was expanding its acquisition network into Europe, his calendar became an intricate map of overseas estate liquidations and extended gallery overtimes. He would leave our loft on a Monday morning for estate sales in London, Paris, or Geneva, returning days later with an exhausted, brilliant smile and a rare piece of furniture to place in our private collection. I was the steady anchor of his system. I curated his travel logs, checked the shipping manifests, and ensured that when he returned from the public arena, his home was a flawless sanctuary. And then there was Vivian. Vivian was my childhood best friend. We had grown up on the same coastal road in Massachusetts. She was a striking Judicer brunette with a sharp, aggressive wit and an intense personal style that contrasted completely with my quiet, platinum blonde demeanor. Vivian was an appraiser of rare jewelry, and 2 years ago, when Julian's firm required a senior curator to oversee the liquidation of international private estates, it was I who signed her evaluation forms. I sat at our dining table, looked into Julian's dark eyes, and said, "Vivian is family, Julian. She knows the market, and she will protect our name. We can trust her with the collection." The human heart has a terrible tendency to ignore the small indicators of structural rot because it wants to believe the building is safe. We accept the long hours, the sudden distances, and the changes in tone because we cannot imagine that the person sleeping next to us is quietly dismantling the floorboards beneath our feet. Have you ever realized that a friend you trusted with your deepest secrets was using those exact details to map your destruction? Tell me below. The structure collapsed on a completely ordinary Tuesday afternoon in November. The gray Atlantic wind was tossing cold sleet against the high windows of my studio. Julian had left at 6 a.m. for a 4-day acquisition trip to Philadelphia to evaluate a collection of pre-war colonial furniture. Vivian had also taken a leave of absence from the gallery, informing me over a brief call that she was staying at her family's country cabin to clear her mind after a grueling autumn season. Vivian had sent a heavy 18th-century French marquetry chest to my workshop the previous week, requesting that I repair a cracked tracking mechanism on the bottom drawer before it was displayed at the winter auction. I was working in the quiet studio using a precise steel scraper to remove layers of degraded wax from the base structure when I noticed the internal weight of the cabinet didn't match its external dimensions. The cedar lining at the very bottom of the framing was a fraction of an inch too high. When I cleared the accumulated grime from the joint, a hidden spring catch clicked beneath my tool. A narrow, hollow drawer dropped down an inch. I reached into the dark aperture, expecting to find old appraisal certificates or historical family documents. My fingers contacted a small, heavy bundle wrapped in a dark silk cloth that smelled intensely of Vivian's expensive lavender perfume. I pulled it onto my workbench, slowly unwrapping the layers. Inside lay a heavy, hand-forged iron skeleton key, its handle engraved with the crest of a private, high-security safety deposit institution in the financial district of Boston. Tucked beneath the key was an old, handwritten notebook bound in dark leather. I opened the ledger. It wasn't a modern diary. It was a cold, precise financial log written in Julian's unmistakable, sharp calligraphy. The entries stretched back 3 entire years. June 14. Acquired the 1790 diamond suite from the Sterling estate. Sienna believes the items were sent to the New York storage vault for a restructuring. Moved the primary stones to Vault Box 412 under Vivian's secondary signature. September 22nd. London travel completed. Vivian accompanied via corporate marketing budget. Liquidated the tech shares from the marital trust. Funds transferred to the private offshore entity in Luxembourg. Total balance $1.4 million. Separation documents can be executed immediately after the Winter Gala. The air in my lungs turned into liquid nitrogen. My mind did not descend into panic. It became an ice-cold calculator. I looked at the handwriting, at the dates, at the cold, systematic liquidation of my father's inheritance, the rare diamonds and historical assets that had been passed to me when he died, which Julian had convinced me to place in his gallery's care for insurance validation. They had converted my family's history into their private escape fund. Every single dinner party I hosted for Vivian, every single time I fixed her jewelry settings, and every single weekend Julian told me he was sweating in a warehouse in Philadelphia, they were sitting in luxury hotels in Europe, systematically signing my life away. I didn't destroy the ledger. I didn't call the police. I took a piece of high-density restoration wax, pressed the iron key into it to create a flawless physical mold, and wrapped the original key back in its silk cloth, sliding it back into the hidden compartment of the chest. I finished the restoration on the drawer, delivered it back to Vivian's apartment via my courier, and walked down to a traditional locksmith in the harbor who understood old mechanisms. Within 2 hours, I held an exact, functional duplicate of the vault key in my hand. Anger makes a woman loud, but absolute betrayal makes her silent. When you realize your entire marriage has been a financial execution, you don't waste energy screaming at an empty room. You enter the vault they built, and you take the wheel. If you found a secret vault key hidden inside your best friend's furniture, would you confront them instantly? Or would you use that key to discover how deep the rabbit hole goes? Let me know your logic below. The next morning at 9 a.m., I walked into the stone-carved headquarters of the Security Safe Deposit Company in downtown Boston. The building was a fortress of granite and polished brass, surviving from the late 19th century. I walked down the marble steps into the subterranean vault room, where a quiet executive in a dark suit reviewed my identity documents. Because my name was still listed on Julian's primary corporate registry for the Sterling Exchange, my clearance was absolute. The executive turned his master key, and I inserted my duplicate iron key into the lock of box 412. The heavy steel door clicked open. Inside the deep metal cavity sat a large velvet-lined case and a leather folder containing the original deeds to 3 luxury beachfront properties in Maine, properties Julian had told me were purchased as corporate investment assets for the firm, which were registered entirely under the joint names of Julian Sterling and Vivian Vance. I opened the velvet case. Resting on the dark silk were my mother's vintage emerald earrings and my father's historical 1790 diamond suite, the assets Julian had reported as temporarily lost in a transit insurance dispute 6 months ago. They hadn't been lost. They had been cached in the dark, waiting for the marriage to dissolve so Vivian could wear them in New York. My hands did not shake. I didn't cry. I pulled a high-resolution portable document scanner from my bag, systematically scanning every single property deed, every offshore bank transit receipt, and every illegal asset transfer document inside that box. I placed the original diamond suite and the emeralds into my personal velvet pouch, replacing them inside the vault box with a series of exact, high-quality cubic zirconia replicas and brass duplicates I had collected from my workshop's restoration inventory. I locked the vault door, returned the duplicate iron key to my bag, and walked out into the cold morning air. Julian returned from his Philadelphia trip on Friday evening. He walked into our harbor loft looking entirely immaculate, his wool coat smelling of cold wind, his eyes carrying that familiar, dominant focus. He dropped his garment bag, walked straight over to my workbench, and pulled me into his arms, kissing my lips with deep, calculated affection. God, it was a grueling 4 days, Sienna. The collectors were impossible, but I managed to secure the primary lot for the winter auction next week. I'm so glad to be home with you. This loft is my only peace. I'm glad you secured the lot, Julian, I said, my voice carrying a perfect melodic clarity. I looked into his dark eyes and felt nothing but a deep, structural disgust. He was no longer my fiancé. He was a fraudulent transaction I was preparing to cancel. The winter gala auction of the Sterling Exchange was scheduled for the following Thursday. It was the biggest night of the New England antique market, an exclusive event where the wealthiest collectors in the country would gather to bid on rare historical artifacts, and where the board directors were scheduled to finalize Julian's 50% equity partnership in the firm. In the 6 days leading up to the auction, the routine ran without a single system error. I cooked his meals, I discussed the auction estimates with him, and I even spent an hour on the phone with Vivian, listening to her discuss the placement of the premium lots. "The catalog is flawless, Sienna," Vivian told me, her voice smooth and affectionate. "We are going to break records next week." "Yes, Vivian," I replied, looking at my father's diamonds sitting safely in my desk drawer. "We are going to break everything." The ultimate revenge does not require a public screaming match or a dramatic scene. It requires you to allow your enemies to believe their plan is succeeding flawlessly until the exact second they step on the platform they built, realize too late that the floor has been removed. Have you ever had to act entirely normal while preparing a legal execution for someone who thought you were blind? Tell me your experience below. The grand gallery of the Sterling Exchange was a display of old-world opulence. High-arched ceilings, crimson velvet drapes, and gold-leaf mirrors reflected the diamonds and tuxedos of over 200 of Boston's elite collectors and corporate directors. The air was filled with the sound of a classical harp and the low, intense hum of high-stakes bidding preparation. Julian was in his absolute element. He stood on the raised auctioneer's podium, looking exceptionally elegant in his bespoke tuxedo, his dark hair immaculate, controlling the room with the subtle movement of his silver gavel. Vivian stood right at the base of the stage, her dark hair styled in sharp waves, wearing an aggressive, low-cut black gown, managing the telephone bids from international buyers. They looked like the undisputed rulers of the market. I walked into the gallery 20 minutes after the auction commenced. I wasn't wearing the quiet, conservative navy or black dresses Julian always selected for me to ensure I remained a decorative background element. I walked through the heavy oak doors wearing an incredibly striking, vibrant neon orange silk evening gown that flowed around my legs like liquid magma, creating a brilliant, burning contrast against the dark wood and heavy crimson drapes of the gallery. My platinum blonde hair fell in dense waves down my shoulders, and my blue eyes were absolute glass. The second I stepped onto the floor, multiple directors turned their heads in surprise. Julian's eyes narrowed slightly from the podium as he recognized the intense orange silk, but he quickly maintained his professional mask, raising his gavel. "We move now to Lot 47, the crown jewel of our winter collection, an authentic 18th century Royal French marquetry cabinet completely restored to original specifications." The assistants wheeled out Vivian's chest, the exact piece of furniture where I had discovered the iron key. "The bidding for this magnificent asset will start at $200,000, Julian announced, his voice booming through the silent room. I didn't stay in the back of the gallery. I walked slowly down the central aisle, the orange silk of my dress catching every light in the room, and raised my silver bidder's paddle. $300,000, I said, my voice flat, calm, and absolute. The crowd gasped. Julian froze on the podium, his gavel hovering in midair, his dark eyes staring at me in complete shock. Vivian turned around, her mouth opening slightly as she realized what pad I was holding. It was the private black tier bidding profile belonging to my family's historical trust, the account Julian thought he had completely drained. "Sienna, what are you doing?" Julian whispered, his microphone picking up his ragged breath. "I am buying back what belongs to me, Julian," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent gallery. 300,000. Call the lot. Julian looked frantically at the board of directors sitting in the front row. He had no legal choice. 300,000. Going once, going twice, sold to Sienna Sterling. He struck the gavel, the sound cracking through the room like a gunshot. Before the assistants could move the chest, I walked straight up to the stage. I didn't lunge at him, and I didn't look at the digital screens. I pulled the original handwritten ledger and the certified bank vault audit documents, signed by the federal forensic investigators I had hired 3 days ago, out of my orange silk clutch. I handed the files directly to Judge Harrison, the chief chairman of the auction house board, who was sitting at the central table. "Judge Harrison," I said, my voice amplified by the secondary microphone on the podium, "the marquetry cabinet I just purchased contains a structural hidden compartment used by your managing director to cache stolen estate assets, including my family's historical diamonds. The ledger you are holding details 3 years of systemic internal embezzlement, offshore money laundering, and artifact forgery conducted by Julian Sterling and Vivian Vance using your firm's license." The ballroom plunged into a terrifying, frozen vacuum of silence. Julian's face turned an absolute unvarnished ash gray under the stage lights. He reached out to grab my arm, his fingers shaking. "Sienna, stop this madness. Judge Harrison, my wife is experiencing a psychological episode." "The police are already in your administrative office, Julian," I said, not shifting my gaze from his panicked eyes. "They have already verified the cubic zirconia replacements inside Vault Box 412. The accounts have been frozen." 2 federal white-collar crime investigators walked through the grand double doors of the gallery, moving quickly down the central aisle. They stepped onto the stage, producing 2 sets of steel handcuffs in front of the entire Boston elite. They secured Julian's wrists before he could take a step, while a third officer escorted Vivian out of the front row, her hands locked behind her back as her backless black gown wrinkled against the cold metal. I stood on the edge of the stage in my vibrant orange silk dress, perfectly still, watching in complete, unbroken silence as my husband and my childhood best friend were marched out of the historic institution into the freezing winter rain, their names permanently deleted from the registry of the city. Exactly 2 years passed after that autumn night at the Sterling Exchange. The autumn wind had returned, turning the Boston harbor into a gray expanse of whitecaps and cold fog. My life didn't end when the gavel fell. It entered a phase of absolute structural realignment. Julian was convicted of grand larceny, corporate embezzlement, and internal asset fraud. He was sentenced to 5.5 years at a federal correctional facility, his professional reputation completely vaporized, his name converted into a permanent warning label within the antiquities market. My legal advisors used the forensic data from the leather ledger to execute a total liquidation of his assets. The court stripped him of every single piece of real estate, every corporate share, and every offshore account he had attempted to conceal. I kept the harbor loft, converting his private office into a clean, bright design archive. I bought out the remaining shares of the gallery, rebranding the institution as the Sienna Heritage Group, an elite asset protection and restoration consultancy that validates the authenticity of historical collections for independent estate owners. I became the sole operator of my own destiny. One Tuesday afternoon, the cold sleet was beating against the glass windows of my workshop. I was sitting at my mahogany desk, reviewing our 4th quarter expansion logs, when my operations manager pushed open the heavy door, looking deeply uncertain. "Miss Sienna," she said quietly, "there is a woman standing at the service entrance downstairs. She doesn't have an appointment, her clothes are completely soaked from the rain, and she's refusing to leave until she speaks with you. She claims she grew up with you. Her name is Vivian." I looked at the gray tide moving against the shipyard walls below. "Send her up," I said. When the heavy elevator doors opened, Vivian stepped into my workspace. The transformation was total, absolute, and entirely logical. The aggressive, arrogant jewelry appraiser in the designer black gown was gone, crushed under the weight of her own parameters. Her dark hair was stringy, unwashed, and stuck to her face from the cold rain. She wore a thin, torn coat that offered no protection from the Atlantic wind, her fingers raw and chapped, stuffed deep into her pockets to hide her intense shaking. She didn't dare take a single step onto the polished timber floor of my studio. She stood near the threshold, her hollow eyes staring at my desk with an expression of pure, unadulterated desperation. "Sienna," she whispered. Her voice was cracked, thin, entirely stripped of that sharp wit she used to use when she lied to me at my own table. "Thank you. Thank you for letting me in from the cold." "You have exactly 2 minutes, Vivian," I said, my voice completely flat, devoid of any hatred or anger. I did not close the structural blueprint I was modifying on my center screen. "Julian took complete advantage of me, Sienna. He emptied all our joint accounts in New York and left me alone with the debts," she sobbed, sinking to her knees. "The court sentenced me to 2 years in prison and $1 million fine. My house is in foreclosure, and no gallery in Boston wants to even hear my name. I'm blacklisted. Please, withdraw the original leather ledger that came out of that antique dresser. Tell the court that I only signed because he forced me to." I stood up from my desk. The vibrant tangerine silk scarf around my neck caught the dim twilight light of the studio windows as I walked slowly over to the glass partition, looking down at the rainy shipyard below. "The data was compiled and locked 2 years ago, Vivian. I do not rewrite history to protect my friends, and I do not delete history to punish my enemies. I simply allow the platform to output the exact reality of the choices you made. You chose to place that iron key beneath your chest. You chose to sit at my table and look at my face while you planned my financial ruin. Enjoy the final compilation of your choices." She didn't scream. She didn't argue. She slowly realized that there was no human emotion left in the room for her to manipulate. She stood up, stepped backward into the cold corridor, and the heavy elevator doors slid shut between us with a silent, final click. Julian remains inside his federal cell, completely stripped of his status and his eloquence. Vivian filed for total personal bankruptcy 3 months later and moved to an obscure small town in another state, her license permanently revoked. Their names are just 2 broken lines of text in the vast history of the city. Do you know why I am telling you this story from the absolute peak of my own independent empire? Because the world wants you to believe that when an entry of betrayal occurs inside your home, you are supposed to scream, cry on the kitchen floor, and let your broken heart destroy your dignity. They want you to believe that your loyalty makes you a victim, that a lying partner can permanently reduce your value. But they don't understand the absolute, unalterable laws of structural balance. Your life is an operating system, and sometimes finding that old ornate key hidden beneath your best friend's antique chest is the only way the platform can force a total, mandatory hard reboot of your reality. It forces you to write off the toxic liabilities. It forces you to delete the parasites that have been draining your capital while you smiled. Julian and Vivian thought they could build a paradise of gold using my silence as their foundation. They forgot the most basic rule of restoration. The person who cleans the wood always knows what is hidden beneath the surface. I am Sienna. The ledger is audited. The balance is zero, and my life finally runs entirely on my own terms. Now, I have a final question for you, the person sitting in the dark right now listening to the sound of my voice. If you found the physical proof of your partner's betrayal hidden inside your best friend's home today, would you confront them instantly in a storm of useless emotion? Or would you use that key to quietly take back everything they stole from you? Tell me your strategy in the comments below. I am reading, and I am watching your logic.